So in this process, the question of assessment is very complex. There are a lot of questions about what you might assess, why you might assess that, how you go about assessing, who in your room has what role in the assessment process, and those big pedagogical questions are the most important ones. As well, there are some practicalities. If you are documenting a large amount of process-based learning, de-emphasizing product, emphasizing the thought process, the metacognitive process, the creative process, then some practical tips for how to keep track of everything, how to document, how to communicate might be helpful. So I just threw a few ideas together that you might want to try using in your classroom. So one of the tools you might want to use for keeping track of your anecdotal records is simply a Word document. If you go into Word and switch to a notebook layout by clicking this button at the bottom, you get these tabs. And the tabs you can organize according to whatever structure makes sense for you. So I might organize it with one tab for each student. I might organize it with a tab for each class or each stage of the project or each aspect of the assessment that I'm keeping track of. And then as you go around and have the conversations with students about their learning, you track what you're noticing about elements of their artistic development, elements of their conceptual development, elements of their processes that they're using in their learning. You can keep track of notes in here. What I really like, though, is this audio feature. And so if you click on audio notes, you'll notice that I can record a note in line. So if I'm sitting down and having a conversation with a child, I can just click on record. It's recording my conversation. The student and I talk about their learning. I click stop, and I have an embedded audio note right there that I can go back to. If I want to find it, I can say conversation about aesthetic awareness on March 29th, for example, and I can keep track of the things that I want to remember about that child's learning. So this is a recording page that I picked up from a teacher at a junior high in one of our schools. She used it in social studies, but I like the idea of having students keep track of the feedback that they get in class and submit it with their work. So what she does is for every project that they do, they have a space for the child to reflect on their own work, sort of help you pay attention to what is important. And then places where they've had peer feedback or teacher feedback, they document what the conversation was. So if I sit next to a child and have a conversation about their learning, there's sort of a culture of that being my responsibility to document if I want it for my records. And I think it's more impactful if the student is the one recording that conversation instead. And if you want to also have it for your records, this approach is an interesting one. So the student would write down, we had this conversation, this is what Mr. So-and-so said about my work. And then in the next column, they have a space to write down how they use that feedback to improve their work or what next steps that led to. So that anytime they're submitting work for evaluation, they have this documentation of the feedback and the action that was taken so that you can see it in their finished product or their partially finished product, depending on what you're evaluating. Okay, so this is just a generic image, so don't try and read what's on the stickies. But one approach to formative assessment or assessment that guides learning forward is to help make the learning visible to the teacher and the student, and from this between the students and one another. So if there's a way of organizing a shared space in your classroom where people can keep track of what they've tried, what they're working on, where they're headed, where they're going a few steps down the road, then they can look to one another for support. So if I'm at this stage and I've used this tool and I've tried this technique and I know that the next thing I need to learn is this, then I could look to the kids who are working at that stage and see who can help me from there. So I'm building that network of support within the classroom. The other way to use this would be to sort of, as a teacher, notice which students are productively stuck and which students are not productively stuck. So a lot of times kids get into a project and they're maybe spinning their wheels and they're either troubleshooting, problem solving, testing and refining their approach, or they're down a rabbit hole that they can't get themselves out of. So keeping track of who has been stuck at this stage for a really long time versus who has gone this way and that way and back this way, or this way and this way and this way and this way and back that way, can help you to keep track of who needs a push in the right direction. So one of the ways that you can equip your students to be effective formative assessors in your classroom is to help them develop a repertoire of questioning techniques. I think a lot of times what comes out of an assessment conversation is not so much an evaluation of learning or an endpoint or an aha moment that is given to the learner by the assessor, as much as there's value in the conversation about the learning. So when you set up students to work with one another in assessment, rather than having them have an evaluative conversation, if they can try to have a descriptive conversation, so that their job in speaking to one another about their work is to develop a shared understanding more than it is to make a judgment about the quality of the work. So for example, if you set them up to have a conversation that's tell me about, what do you mean by, can you give an example of, or what if this, or suppose that, or imagine this, or some reflective questions around what do you understand now that you didn't understand before? What caused your thinking to change? These kinds of questioning have value in the process so that the learner is prompted to reflect and refine their understanding so that they can take a next step in their learning without necessarily being told what to do. Okay, so if you're working in IRIS, there are some ways of gathering data and entering data that are more efficient than others. So if I go to my students landing page and I'm looking at all students, or I'm looking at my grade of students or my class of students, typically I could go into one student, create a current learning note, and write, this is what I noticed about whatever it is about the student learning that you need to keep track of, and save the note. And then that goes in that student's current learning database. But if you want to work with a group of students at once, you could pull a set of students. So this small group perhaps is doing a presentation, or I'm working with them today, or we had a conversation together, and create a current learning note about any number of them without leaving this modal window. So I could pull up my whole class here as well. But what I can do here is say, I'm looking at test Abal. These are all test accounts. You would have your students' photos here. And I could write a note about that student. And then as I'm watching and listening or having the conversation, I can pop in, add a note about another student, and I'm not leaving this modal window. So it becomes a really quick way to enter data about multiple students. Similarly, at the end of the day, you sit down and you think about the 10 things that you noticed and you want to keep track of, pop all those notes into their profile. You can go in and tag it as art, or tag it as whatever it is that you're working on, drama perhaps, or social studies, or English language arts. The other thing you can do is tag it according to results if you're keeping track of data there that might inform your next instruction, or that you want to keep track of for reporting at a later date. So each of those notes now goes into each of the children's current learning sections of their profile. If I went into Test Abal, I would see there's the note that I made, and I have that record for when I need it again. So the other thing, of course, if you're using IRIS, is to use the student side. And IRIS was really designed so that students could keep track of their learning as they go forward. So if you are, and get feedback on their learning. So if you are evaluating process, if your goal in this work is to help students reflect on the decisions they've made, why they made those decisions, and what impact their decisions had on their project, you could use IRIS, or if you're using some other tool or system in your classroom, even if it's a paper portfolio, of keeping track of what decisions did they make and why. So they might start by uploading an artifact that it was a provocation that they used. So let me see what I've got here. this image, perhaps, would have been something that the student had chosen as a provocation that got them thinking about their learning. So they could upload the artifact, and then they could write a comment about the artifact. So I love this image of it's a marine disaster, and these are all dead fish. And if the student had chosen this image, they might even just write a comment about what they are wondering about, or what it makes them feel, or how it relates to the question that they're exploring, or why it speaks to them in particular. And in this way, they're keeping track of their own thinking as they go through the project. So their next artifact might be an upload that has this image and a piece of audio attached to it. And they can write about why this image and this audio go together and what impact they're trying to have. Or they might put in an artifact that's just a note. And when they put in the note, they can talk about this is why I got stuck. So perhaps this is, they're working with an app that isn't working, and they could write about this is why I got stuck and how I got unstuck and what I learned in the process. And then the focus for the assessment isn't so much on what the finished product looks like, or how it how polished it was in the end, but can be more about the process, the artistic process, the creative process, the learning process. And they can notify teachers and get comments back, which is helpful too, but mostly it's about a space to think about learning.